This is Law Bytes, a podcast with Michael Geist.
As we begin with a multi-billion-dollar deal that would merge two of the most powerful business families in Canada, Rogers Communications has agreed to buy its rival, Shaw Communications, and red flags are already being raised about what it could mean for consumers. The transaction is valued at $26 billion, including $6 billion in debt. Rogers and Shaw carved up Canada when it came to cable and internet service. Rogers operated in the east and Shaw in the west, but they have been fierce combatants in the wireless sector. Now, Rogers is promising to invest $2.5 billion to build 5G networks in Western Canada, plus $1 billion to give rural, remote, and Indigenous communities high-speed internet. It's also promising to create 3,000 jobs in Western Canada. Big money and big promises. None of it will happen unless the deal gets federal approval, and that will include explaining why less competition is good for consumers.
When the proposed Rogers-Shaw merger was announced last month, it immediately became a flashpoint for Canada's ongoing debate over wireless competition and pricing. While the companies promised big benefits, most consumers did indeed have a hard time reconciling how less competition would lead to anything other than higher prices. The merger review is likely to take a year, with government, the CRTC, and the Competition Bureau all having their say on the deal. Canada's politicians wasted little time in putting the proposed merger under the microscope, as the Standing Committee on Industry, Science and Technology launched hearings on the agreement. Rogers and Shaw kicked things off with their perspective, followed by several days of hearings with academics, competitors, and regulators. I was invited to appear before the committee and provide my take on the implications of the merger. This week's Law Bytes podcast goes inside the virtual hearing room with my short opening statement, followed by clips of the Q&A with several members of Parliament. The hearing began with an invitation from Chair Sherry Romanato to provide opening thoughts for 3 minutes.
Professor Geist, you have the floor for 3 minutes.
Great. Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you so much for the invitation and the opportunity to come back and appear before the committee. My name is Michael Geist. I'm a law professor at the University of Ottawa, where I hold the Canada Research Chair in Internet and E-commerce Law, and I'm a member of the Centre for Law, Technology and Society. I appear in a personal capacity representing only my own views. To the best of my recollection, a 3-minute opening statement is the shortest I've experienced for a committee appearance. In this instance, however, I think it's appropriate, as it doesn't take much more than 3 minutes to understand what is at play and at stake with the proposed Rogers-Shaw merger. I'd like to make 3 points to start. First, and I think this is stating the obvious, the deal will result in higher prices and less competition in the Canadian wireless market. There's no need to overthink this. Removing a company that some have touted as the best chance at a viable national fourth carrier would leave some of Canada's biggest markets, notably Ontario, Alberta, and BC, without a much-needed competitor. While some seek to justify it or explain it away, the simple reality is that Canadians already pay some of the highest prices for wireless services in the world. If this merger is approved, the situation is likely to get worse. Indeed, when Rogers promises that it will not raise prices for Shaw Freedom Mobile customers for 3 years, it effectively signals that it will be raising them as soon as the clock runs out on that timeline. Second, this represents a major wireless policy failure. Successive governments have pledged to address high wireless costs, but have often instead taken half measures or even backtracked at opposition from the incumbent providers. The CRTC is little better, with the current leadership having dispensed with the prioritization of consumers. It's the CRTC that initially rejected mandated MVNOs, the CRTC that signaled it was supportive of increasing consumer broadband costs with new levies in its harnessing change report, and it's the CRTC that sparked a consumer group boycott of the development of an internet code that was ostensibly designed to protect consumers. Third, what should the committee be recommending? The preferable choice is no merger, since it's likely to result in lost jobs, higher prices, and less competition. If approved with conditions, the grab bag of goodies proposed by Rogers is really just asking consumers to ultimately pay for rural and remote connectivity initiatives. We need that connectivity, but funding it through a harmful merger is not the right way to do it. Instead, the focus should be on competition, particularly wireless competition. For the purposes of this transaction, I think that means full divestiture of the wireless assets. More broadly, it means doubling down on policies designed to address wireless competition, in particular, support for mandated MVNOs that would help change the competitive landscape, and efforts to increase foreign entrants into the marketplace. I look forward to your questions.
Once the Q&A began, Liberal MP Ali Ehassi asked about 2 points from my opening remarks: divestiture of the wireless assets and confidence in the CRTC.
If I could start off with Professor Geist. Thank you for your remarks. I think it's important in particular to highlight your concern that a merger would have adverse impact on competition, in particular in Ontario, Alberta, and BC. Now, I wanted to go to the third recommendation you made, where you touched on the issue of divestiture. If you were holding the pen and you could compel Rogers and Shaw to divest certain assets, what would those assets be?
Thanks for the question, and thanks again for the invitation. I think the starting point is to recognize the wireless assets have to go. And one can understand why there may still be significant value for those two companies on the cable side, and of course the kind of competition that exists, given, as Professor Winczek noted, a divided up market dating back now decades, has less implications, it seems to me, for the everyday consumer, although it may have some broader market impact. But on the wireless side, the impact is obvious, and so full divestiture of the wireless assets to find some mechanism to maintain at least the prospect of a fourth national player, I think, has to be the starting point.
Thank you for that. Now, my second question for you is your second recommendation touched very much on the failings of the CRTC. I was wondering, after the Governor and Council order in 2019, where the CRTC was ordered to consider consumer interests, do you think that's going to make a difference? Is that going to be sufficient to compel CRTC to really put that at the center of their consideration of this merger?
I wish I could say the answer is yes, but I have significant doubts, to be candid. I don't believe, and with all respect to current chair of the CRTC, that what we've seen over the last number of years is a prioritization of consumers. And I identified several examples of how that is. I think the GIC that we saw go back also, certainly referenced consumers, but it referenced other factors as well. And I have some concerns that the way the CRTC is going to interpret that is not to put consumers at the center of its policy, in the same way that it hasn't put consumers at the center of its policy on a number of different issues, including even ones that were designed specifically to address consumer concerns.
NDP MP Brian Massey, a long-standing member of the committee, asked about the impact of divestiture.
Thank you for the quick 3 minutes. That was my idea to get a lot of witnesses in here, so you can blame me. But I'm also reached the conclusion early in this discussion that eliminating any one of the four players is not good public policy. In fact, I have the unenviable, the point here of defending the Titanic in terms of the current system, because all I can see is it getting worse by what's taking place here. I'm going to go with my first question to Mr. Geist. I'm a little bit concerned about how we would almost like be gerrymandering the assets of Shaw here with peeling off Freedom Mobile and then expecting it to be a winner in the market. It seems like a big gamble for me, as opposed to where it currently resides, a couple of different ways and revenue streams. And if we just kind of siphoned off one part of it, I don't know what would be left. And it just seems like a bad approach, in my opinion, to trying to provide more competition.
I started with the recommendation that this not go ahead, and I think you're right that, best case, quite frankly, if our concern is competition, if our concern is ensuring a viable fourth player in all markets, and preferably even a national player, that frankly this merger simply wouldn't go through. We see, from the perspective of many consumers, bundled type offerings where there's an expectation that they're going to buy more than just a wireless service, they'll buy multiple services, is a pretty accepted part for a lot of consumers. And peeling it off into a wireless only play, and a smaller play at that point in time, presents some significant challenges in the marketplace. I don't think there's any doubt. I mean, I guess the notion of full divestiture is, if this does go ahead, then the question was, well, what do we do? And that seemed to me the best available approach. But I don't disagree. I think it still leaves us with a setback with respect to competition in Canada.
Since my comments raised the potential of MVNOs to support competition, Liberal MP Nate Erskine-Smith asked for further comments on that policy issue.
Mr. Geist, spoken also about the need for MVNOs. I agree. I wonder what you think about the Competition Bureau's view. In a submission to the CRTC, they emphasized the need for greater competition, emphasized a role for MVNOs, but it was almost like a very targeted role to better facilitate or better create and allow for facilities-based competitors to get a foothold and to really grow facilities-based competition, pointing to Eastlink and Freedom in particular. Do you think MVNOs should be used in such a targeted way, or should be used more expansively?
I think there's room to be more expansive. When I mentioned in my opening remarks sort of the half measures, I think the approach we've seen on MVNOs is reflective of that, where the starting position, of course, was no, because there's this tendency seemingly never to allow for these new forms of competition. Once we started to see continually the experience of the high pricing in Canada, there was at least an acknowledgement that perhaps this might offer up some possibility, but again, doing so in a slow way, and we see that coming out of the regulator, and we saw CC as well. This is a debate that's been ongoing now for so many years, and it seems pretty clear that what we've done to date hasn't worked, and we need to be far more aggressive from a policy perspective.
Can I ask on that, the debate going on for years, you follow this debate certainly more than I have, and when we look at MVNOs delivering lower prices, that certainly to me matters a great deal. The biggest digital divide is one on income in this country. You'll hear my 4-year-old in the background. I apologize. When it comes to the other digital divide, though, the one that Mr. Wood is most concerned about, and rightfully concerned, we want companies to build. And there is, and the Competition Bureau notes this, the CRTC's noted this, there is a challenge here. We're competing interests. The more we allow MVNOs, potentially the big three tell us, well, we're not going to build as much. Has there been any conversation in this space about where companies build that for a certain period of time, they have a monopoly over that build, but then it is opened up after a period? In other legal spaces, we have this framework. Has this been part of the debate?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think there's been a recognition that the company's given a choice down on the urban areas where they're already serving, as opposed to going to the rural and remote communities. And so they seem to almost hold out for these kinds of situations. We saw it in Manitoba. We're seeing it now, to hold out the kind of goodies to say, hey, if only you approve this, then we'll really go ahead into these communities. It has that policy, that strategy hasn't worked. And I think my view is that it's really been the role of governments to do a better job of saying we've got to invest in these communities if the companies aren't willing to do so, and use a more open approach as part of that.
Conservative MP Pierre Poilievre used his entire time allotment to ask me questions focused on market issues, including the potential and implications of foreign investment.
Dr. Geist, you said that in the event that this merger goes ahead, that the wireless assets of Shaw would have to be spun off, and that there would need to be policy changes to invite more foreign competition into the Canadian marketplace. Could you describe mechanically what you mean by that? What would be, if you had to write out kind of an IKEA instruction manual for us, what would it say?
Well, let's focus on the foreign ownership issue, and I think Professor Winsack rightly noted that we've seen this movie before, and it doesn't end well. And certainly the Verizon experience is suggestive of that. I think the starting point, quite frankly, is to remove really all barriers, open the market up to foreign entrants. I'm not sure that that's going to result in a fundamental change. Many of when Verizon, as Dwayne said, kicked the tires on Canada, they saw enormous opposition from the big three and just decided Canada wasn't worth their while. There were other places where they could make money without having to fight three large incumbents. But opening up the market fully so that a company could think about entering in potentially not just with those assets, but potentially some of the larger assets as well, might provide at least someone with the perspective that this is an attractive enough market. And from a consumer perspective, bringing in that kind of pricing power, that sort of roaming ability on a global level, opens the door, I think, to opportunities that Canadians don't experience, but consumers in many other countries do.
What regulatory changes would that opening up require?
Remove the cap. Well, it would in this situation, it would certainly require removing any sort of cap, which we have right now. You can grow into a larger foreign-owned entity, but you can't take over a Canadian entity above a certain threshold. We could remove those thresholds. We would also have to think about whether or not we want to maintain the current restrictions on broadcast ownership, because, of course, we've seen some of the largest companies also own large broadcast assets. And while the Bill C-10 actually does remove some of the references to Canadian ownership, so in some way the government may be already moving a little bit in that direction, perhaps inadvertently. That's certainly, I think, part of the equation, and perhaps it's part of a broader discussion as to our comfort level with foreign ownership of broadcast assets. But if the issue or the concern comes around airing Canadian content and some other regulatory obligations, I honestly don't see why those couldn't apply to foreign-owned companies in the same way as they apply to Canadian-owned ones.
Right. Now, what would CAD if the condition for approval were that all overlapping services of Rogers and Shaw be spun off?
I think that's the most palatable answer, absent absent saying no to the merger altogether. And I think there are good reasons for still saying no. Shaw is a viable, innovative competitor, as we've already heard, and so taking them out of the market in this space is, I think, a loss ultimately for consumers. But if for legal reasons or other reasons the decision is made that it's going to go ahead, that is the best available alternative.
But what would be the advantage? Like, what would be? You seem to say that even if the wireless and other overlapping services are spun off, the merger still would be a net negative. Why is that? Why exactly would that be the negative? Again, if you're removing freedom and other assets that for which there is competition, you're giving it to some other third provider through an auction or something. Why wouldn't that be just as good?
Well, then I suppose it comes down. I think you're injecting a fair amount of uncertainty into the marketplace, as we have to sort of know the who really matters in this case. If it's a who that's comparable to a Shaw that can offer up some of the bundled services, can compete economically with some of the larger players, and so that it's a fairly seamless transition, well, then the response might be that's about as good as we're going to get, and there probably isn't. There are fewer negative implications. I think we talked about this a little bit earlier, if it's just another standalone player, hearkening back to the days of Wind, I think that is a setback because these assets are stronger in the marketplace from a competitive perspective with a stronger player behind them.
Do I have any more time left, Madam Chair?
17 seconds.
All right. Do you see any prospect for alternative technologies to replace what we have now as opposed to just changing the regulatory model?
I think technology is always going to continue to adapt, and we'll see satellite and some other players come into the marketplace. But at its heart, for so many consumers for the foreseeable future, these wireless assets are absolutely essential from a communications perspective.
The hearing concluded with one last question from MP Massey, who wanted to talk about the implications of approving the deal for the future of wireless in Canada.
Mr. Geist, Professor Geist, go to you. So if we say no to this merger right now, there's going to be a lot of suggestions about the big fallout of not doing this. What do you think is, going to take place next? I know it's a big crystal balling in that, but we've seen Rogers make a play already on Cogeco, a hostile takeover. We've seen now this as is really a shift in our market can consolidate versus build, and should our public policy be really pushing back and saying, no, we need to be building, not consolidating?
Well, it's a great question. I think Ben early referenced the prospect that SaskTel would be next on the shopping list for some of the players if this goes ahead. I think this is, I think in some ways, the Manitoba deal set this up. It sent the message that it was possible to get these deals through as long as you provided a grab bag of goodies and just say, hey, look at all the nice things you're going to get if you pass this. But then we do see that there is a cost to be paid. We've seen it in terms of the kind of innovation and pricing that takes place in that market. If the signal coming out of this is that this goes ahead, then I think it becomes open season for some of those remaining players. If we stop it here, I think that it reaffirms that strong signal that consumers and competition are the policy priority in the country. And as long as we twin it with things like MVNOs, as we've been hearing about, there is at least the prospect of better competition and better pricing in the country.
That's the Law Bytes podcast for this week. If you have comments, suggestions, or other feedback, write to lawbytes@pobox.com. Follow the podcast on Twitter @LawBytesPod or Michael Geist @mgeist. You can download the latest episodes from my website at michaelgeist.ca or subscribe via RSS at Apple Podcast, Google, or Spotify. The Law Bytes podcast is produced by Gerardo Lebron Laboy. Music by the Laboy brothers, Gerardo and Jose Lebron Laboy. Credit information for the clips featured in this podcast can be found in the show notes for this episode at michaelgeist.ca. I'm Michael Geist. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.